All right, everyone, it is 6 o'clock. I think we'll have more people streaming in shortly, but I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So thank you to those who have arrived on time for tonight's college prep talk. It is the first one of the semester, so we are excited to get started. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sadie Weiss, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Office of Pre-Collegiate Student Services. And my wonderful colleague, Taylor Duncan, is on the call this evening as well. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to put those in the chat, and we'll answer those for you. Excited to announce that tonight's session is all about understanding your financial aid award letters. As students start to receive those now, it's perfect timing to have this conversation. So I would like to introduce Teresa Steinkamp and Grace Carlson from the Scholarship Foundation of St. Louis. We had a great session with them last year, and so looking forward to this evening session as well. We are recording this session just to give everybody a heads up. Like I said, if you have any questions, put them in the chat, but we'll go ahead and get started. So thank you, Teresa, and thank you, Grace, for being here. I will pass the mic over to you.
Thanks. Grace is going to get us started, but can you enable screen sharing, Sadie, please? We can pull up the PowerPoint. I should have asked about that earlier. Sorry, Sadie.
That's okay.
All right, take it away, Grace.
Perfect. Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Grace. I'm one of the student advisors at the Scholarship Foundation of St. Louis. We're a nonprofit organization here in St. Louis that aims to help students to and through college. And we're here to talk to you a little bit about decision-making and using financial aid offer letters to assess affordability. So again, my name is Grace. My colleague Teresa Steinkamp is here as well. And we're excited to be here with you guys tonight. Okay, so first let's talk a little bit about the information we're going to cover and what our objectives are tonight. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about some key terms and some language that's really important to understand while considering financial aid and financial aid offer letters. And then I'll also review kind of the different types and sources of financial aid as well. And then Teresa is really going to get kind of into the nitty gritty, talking about assessing and comparing financial aid offers, using those letters to kind of understand affordability, identifying options for perhaps when that aid isn't going to go quite far enough to cover your costs. And then also talking a little bit about professional judgment reviews and special circumstances. What are they? How do they work? And kind of the processes around those options. So the first thing we're going to start with is some key terms and some language. So all of these kind of words or phrases that we're going to go over tonight are all really important fundamental understandings to help you understand your financial aid offers and kind of the financial aid process in general. So first, we're going to start with cost of attendance. And so this is everything that you as a student are going to be expected to pay for a given year to go to school. So this includes your direct costs and your indirect costs and all of the costs that you have for that year. So a little bit more about direct and indirect costs. A direct cost is going to be something that is paid directly to the school. So when you look at a billing statement, this is going to be what shows up on that bill. And so these are things like tuition and fees. If you're an on-campus student, room and board, meal plan, that kind of stuff. Anything that you are paying directly to the school is a direct cost. And then your indirect costs are additional costs that are necessary to be a student, but may not be paid directly to the school. And so these include things like transportation, textbooks, supplies, expenses. If you are a student with a child, childcare, all of these other fees that you may incur in a given year in the process of getting your education, even if you aren't paying them directly to school, there's still fees that you need to take into consideration while you're budgeting. The next one we want to talk about is expected family contribution, or EFC. So your EFC is a number that comes from filing your FAFSA. It is after you've gone through the process, filed that application, the number that you get after your application has been processed. And this is what kind of FAFSA and the federal government says you can reasonably pay towards college every year. So while it's not intended to be an exact amount that you have to pay towards school every year, it is the first thing that is going to be subtracted from that cost of attendance total kind of sticker number for your education for a year. So it kind of acts actually as an expected number that your family can pay each year towards school. A little note on EFC, there are some changes coming to the FAFSA next year. So this is actually the last year that we will be using an EFC. The number, how it's calculated, and the acronym for it will be changing next year. But for now, EFC is still being used and being considered. Okay. So the next term we want to talk about is a financial aid package and what that really is. So a financial aid package is going to be all of the different types of aid that you are qualified for, kind of listed out and included in one, hopefully neat little package. All of this financial aid is intended to help you cover the rest of your costs. So we talked about cost of attendance. The first thing that's subtracted is your EFC. And then all of this aid comes into play to help you cover the rest of your costs that exist after that EFC is subtracted. So then we have our unmet need. So unmet need is going to be the remaining costs after all of your aid is subtracted. So again, we start with our cost of attendance, we subtract our EFC, all of our aid comes into play, and whatever is left is going to be your unmet need. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about different sources of financial aid and what the different types of financial aid out there really are. So let's start with grants. There's lots of different sources for grants from the federal government, state government, institutional, meaning the school you're going to, private organizations, charitable organizations. Some that you may already be familiar with, for example, the Pell Grant is a federal grant. Access Missouri is a big state grant here in Missouri. And then there's lots of other places that you can go out and look for grants. So some important things to know about grants. They could be either need or merit-based, meaning it could be based on your financial need, or it could be based on something perhaps that you've achieved, like good grades. Academic achievements are pretty common sources of grant money. Grants are gift aid, meaning that they don't need to be repaid. So we sometimes refer to this as free money. This is the money that down the line you are not going to have to repay. It's just here now to help you pay for school. Some grants can be first come, first served. So it's important to get your FAFSA filed as early as possible and be kind of keeping up with your financial aid process to the extent that you can. FAFSA may be required for some grants. It is definitely required for all federal grants, and for many state grants, it is required to be considered for state grants here in Missouri. So it's really important if you are eligible to file the FAFSA to be doing that so you can be considered for all of the aid that you may be eligible for. And then grants are renewable, meaning that you can renew them year after year as you continue your education, as long as you continue to meet those eligibility criteria. Now let's talk a little bit about scholarships. Again, there's many different sources of scholarships. There are national scholarship program, local scholarship program, individual schools give out their own scholarships, different organizations, corporations that you can look for if you're searching for scholarships. Some features of scholarships, again, these can be need or merit-based. They also are gift aid, meaning they don't need to be repaid down the line. Typically, scholarships have separate application processes outside of just applying to the schools you're interested in. And some scholarships may require that you have completed a FAFSA if you're eligible. Some scholarships are one-time only awards, meaning that you just get that money for 1 year, which can be really great. But it's important to keep in mind that as you continue through your college education, you will need to find ways to replace those one-time awards. So it's always good to have in mind as you're searching for scholarships, whether or not something is renewable or a one-time award. So some other considerations while you're working through the scholarship search, we never want to be paying for scholarships. It just doesn't make sense, right? If you're looking for money to pay for school, it doesn't make any sense that you would have to pay someone to give you that money. So always be really conscious of that and look for free places to apply for scholarships. There's lots of options out there. Again, we talked a little bit about the renewable versus one-time awards. Whether or not a scholarship is portable can be really important. So that means, is it a scholarship that I can just use at this school, or is it something that follows me if I decide to transfer? It's not uncommon for students to transfer schools at some point in their college career. So it's really important to know whether or not those scholarship dollars can follow you. And then recognizing the impact on institutional aid. So if you are applying for outside scholarships from organizations like the Scholarship Foundation, for example, sometimes if you bring in outside scholarship dollars, the college you're going to can actually lower the amount of scholarships they are offering you. So it can be really important to understand, if you're bringing in outside dollars, how is that going to impact the money that you've already been offered from your school? Because if we're just kind of trading out those dollars, it doesn't make a lot of sense, because then you still end up with money that you may need to pay out of pocket or additional scholarships you may need to find. So it's always good to kind of keep that in mind and ask those questions as you're working with your admissions office or folks at your school. How will outside scholarships impact my aid from your institution? Okay. Work study is another form of financial aid. And so there's really only two places that this comes from. This is either from the federal work study program, or some colleges and universities have their own institutional work study program. And this is a little bit different than grants or scholarships, in that this is what's considered self-help aid. So students have to be doing something to receive this aid. In this case, work study often looks like working at an on-campus job, or being hired through the school to work in jobs. There's lots of different options. Sometimes it may look like working in the dining hall or library. Some folks have tutoring programs. It really depends on the school that you go to. Often these are also first come, first serve, and students have to go through kind of a typical job application. And so they may need to apply, go through an interview process, and secure that job before their work study money can come to them. This money does not need to be repaid, but folks or schools may take into consideration whether or not students have financial need when they're deciding and hiring for these work study jobs. FAFSA is required to be eligible for work study, and every school's policies and programs are a little bit different. So I highly recommend checking in with the school that you are interested in or you're planning on going to see what their work study policy is. And then finally, loans, everyone's least favorite part of talking about financial aid, but an important part. So there are several different sources of student loans. Ones that folks are typically most familiar with are going to be the federal student loans. So there are both federal loans that are made to a student directly, and there also are federal loans that can be made to a parent to help pay for a student's education. There are private loans. And then there are also charitable organizations that offer student loans. So for example, the Scholarship Foundation, we offer an interest-free student loan. A little bit about loans and how they differ from the other financial aid we've talked about so far. Again, this is self-help aid. So students kind of have to be doing something to receive this aid. In this case, it means that you are borrowing the money right now to pay for your education, but in the long run, you will need to repay that money. It's not free money, it's not gift money, it's something that will need to be repaid down the line. For most loans, this includes interest. So for our federal student loans and many private loans, there's going to be money tacked on top of what you actually borrowed, meaning that over time you end up paying more than you actually borrowed. The federal student loans don't require a credit check or a cosign, but the federal parent loan and many private loans do require some of those additional steps. And the FAFSA is required for any of the federal student loans. And now I will turn it over to Teresa.
Thank you, Grace, for walking us through all of that. And as Grace shared, I'm going to walk us through some of the nitty-gritty pieces of comparing financial aid packages. And Grace knows this, but I live in the weeds. So this is the kind of thing I love to talk about. So bear with me as we dive deep here. So the first piece I want to just address is really, why is it even important to compare financial aid offers? So it is possible that you will have one financial aid package. It's possible that you will have multiple financial aid offers. It's honestly our hope that you have more than one, so you do have the ability to compare. And there are some reasons why we think it's important for you to be able to compare financial offers before making a decision. So the first is knowledge. It's important for anyone who's making this decision to be able to identify the forms of financial aid that they're receiving. It's also important to be able to total how much financial aid is being offered and to understand what, if any, gap or unmet need remains that still needs to be covered. College is not a one-year investment, so you also need to consider, if I'm borrowing this much for my first year, can I project how much I may be borrowing over 4 or 5 years, depending on how long it takes me to graduate? And then to think through, what are the long-term consequences of this debt? The second piece is financial planning. So borrowing is a really personal decision. And although we may have recommendations on how much to borrow or how much maybe not to borrow, if you have the option to do that, it is a really personal decision. And so it's important for the student and the family to reflect on how much debt they're willing to take out in their name and what the implications of that debt may be. We would also recommend that you research the starting and average salaries in the career fields that you're thinking. We know that lots of students change their plans while they're in college, but it's important to think about what the potential salary would be and what the impact of that would be on an individual's ability to repay that student loan debt down the road. And then how does that potential student loan debt affect other long-term goals and plans that someone may have? It could be things like buying a house or buying a car, traveling, starting a business. Any of those things are going to be potentially affected by student loan debt down the road. The third piece is bargaining tools. So colleges won't like it if you come in and tell them that you're going to negotiate or bargain, but in some ways you are able to do this. So this is, so you want to compare financial aid offers to see really which school is the most affordable. And particularly if you have schools that are similar in cost, or similar in cost and similar in type, you might be able to take a financial aid package from school A to school B and say, school A has given me a great financial aid package, but I'd really like to come here to school B. Is there anything that you can do to make this a more affordable option? And in some cases that may be possible. It's, again, most common with schools that are going to be similarly situated. So, you know, you might say like SLU and Maryville, you could compare, but maybe not SLU and SIUE because they're two very different kinds of institutions. So you would want to have, again, schools that are similar. And then if you are asking for more money, in some cases, you may have to be prepared to back it up with additional facts and information. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about professional judgment review. The fourth reason to compare is surprises. So we'll see an example of this in just a little bit, but frankly, it's impossible to know which school is going to be the most affordable until you have the financial aid package in front of you and you can really do the math to see how much financial aid has been offered and to be able to determine how much you still owe out of pocket. Cost and affordability are not necessarily the same thing. So a high cost school that offers a really generous financial aid package may be more affordable than a lower cost school that hasn't been able to offer the same kind of financial aid. And then the fifth and perhaps most important reason to compare financial aid packages is really just the process of decision making. So no pressure to the students on the call or even the parents or guardians of students on the call, but this is one of the biggest financial decisions, financial investments that a lot of people make in their lives. And so having all of the information, really taking all of that information into consideration before finalizing a decision about where to go to school, what to take on in the way of student loan debt is really critical. And so we really want to encourage you to compare those financial aid offers as you receive them. And of course, now I'm seeing all of these slides that I forgot were back here. So we're going to kind of go through those. Clearly, this is our first decision-making workshop in a while. So you'll see all of this, but I'm not going to go through all of those details again, because we kind of talked about them already. One of the things that I do want to point out on this decision-making slide here, though, is that when a school offers you student loans, if you do not need them or want them, you are able to decline them. We do encounter students every year who made the decision to borrow because they thought they had no choice. And so just because something is offered on a financial aid package does not mean that you have to take those loans out, nor does it mean that you are required to borrow the full loan amount. So it is possible to accept partial loan amounts. And we do see students do that if they've been offered $4,000, but they really only need to borrow $2,000. A student has the ability to accept a partial loan award. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about comparing financial aid packages. So more specifics about what to look for. So these are some things that we would encourage you to look for broadly. So first is cost. Grace talked about cost of attendance. Does the financial aid offer give you the full cost of attendance? And does that cost of attendance include all of the direct costs and the indirect costs? So I would say if you receive a financial aid package and it says only information about direct costs, that's a red flag because the financial aid may not adequately cover all of the expenses that you have in order to cover a full cost of attendance. With regard to grants and scholarships, you want to have a sense of what is the total amount of free money that is being offered. And you want to know, to something that Grace mentioned earlier as well, are those grants and scholarships renewable? And if so, what are the requirements to maintain eligibility and renew them each year? So most commonly, we see students are required to maintain a particular grade point average. And just to be candid, it's important to know whether or not that's reasonable for the student. There are some schools that offer merit-based scholarships where the GPA is exceptionally high, and that's a lot of stress and pressure on a student who's starting college for the first time. And that may, even if it's reasonable, it may not feel very comfortable for the student. And so having conversations about that and not putting undue pressure on the student. The other thing to think about, particularly in some circumstances, is whether or not the scholarship would still be available to the student if they were to change their major. So on federal work study, so Grace alluded to this earlier, and there's some specific things that we would want you to look for. And I think it's very unlikely you will see any of this printed on a financial aid letter, although it would be great if it were. We would love to see these details, but more likely you're going to have to engage in a conversation with the college to get some of this information. So first is, do they have any instructions on how you can actually go about securing a work study position? Even once you have a work study award on a financial aid package, until you have the work study job, that money is not a guaranteed source of financial assistance. It's also worth considering how many hours a week you would need to work as a student to earn that work study award. Generally speaking, work study awards are not so large at this point that a student would need to work more than a handful of hours. But that also begs the question whether or not it's enough of a work study award. Does the student potentially need to have another job? And what are the implications of trying to schedule 2 part-time jobs around classes and other commitments on campus? I would also really encourage you to find out if the college has any key dates by which a student either has to accept a work study award or receive a work study position to actually have those work study funds come through. So we are aware of some colleges that if a student does not accept their award by a certain date, the school will take that award back and give it to another student. Work study funds are campus-based, and so the college has a particular budget and they have limited funds to award to a significant number of students in some circumstances. So knowing if there's any particular dates that need to be met and then adhering to those dates is critical. We've also learned in the last few years that there are some schools where the student, if they choose not to participate in federal work study their first year, they are not eligible to participate in subsequent years. So if a student elects not to do it in their first year of college, do they have the choice to participate in future years? And so those are all things we would encourage you to think about from a work study standpoint. There's obviously a lot to take into consideration when you're thinking about loans and student loan borrowing, but in particular, when you are comparing financial aid packages and looking at loans, you want to know how much is being offered and what loans have been offered to the student and potentially the parents. You want to know about the interest rates, the terms and conditions on all of the loans being offered. And again, you may not find this information on a financial aid package. You may have to go elsewhere to get some of that information. Just so you are aware, interest rates on federal loans, both for the student and the parents, have not yet been established for next school year. Those are typically not published until May. And so you may have financial aid packages and you may not know the information about some of this detail on loans until the summer. We hope that financial aid packages would make it clear to you that you can accept partial loan amounts or you can decline any loans that you do not need or want. We would also want you to look to see if it's clear that the parents have to pass a credit check for the parent loan. So that parent loan that may be offered on a financial aid package is not a given until the parent has passed the credit check. Does the financial aid package provide any instructions on where or how or when you would complete entrance counseling, where to sign the promissory note? And again, it would be important for you as a student, as a family to reflect on how much are you willing to borrow per year and in total to cover the cost of your education. Under family considerations, it's really important to know what your expected family contribution is from the FAFSA. Again, that's not what you have to pay, but so much financial aid eligibility hinges on what that number is. And so it's important to know what it is, to look at it and make sure that everything on the FAFSA has been filled out correctly. It's important too to know what is the unmet need. So is there still money that the student is going to owe after all financial aid has been accounted for? And to have a conversation as a household about what, if anything, is actually realistic for the family to contribute out of pocket. So for appeals and adjustments, again, we're going to talk about this a little bit more in depth, but when it comes to the financial aid packages in particular, when you're reviewing and comparing them, has the school made it clear to the student that if they wish to be considered for additional financial aid through an appeals process, do they have instructions on either who to speak with or what would be the steps to initiate that process? And then again, does the school have a policy for adjusting their financial aid offers? This is known as aid adjustment or aid displacement if a student receives outside scholarships. So do they have that information in writing somewhere for you to be able to understand what would be the effect on your existing financial aid offer if you were to receive additional outside awards? And then looking ahead, so do the financial aid offers provide details about who to contact if the student has questions or concerns? Are there instructions about what to do next, such as accepting or declining aid? Does the school give any instructions on additional forms that may be needed and any deadlines associated with that paperwork? Is there a deadline to accept financial aid? It's also important to see if the financial aid offer says any of these words: estimate, preliminary. These words may indicate that there is additional action that is required to ensure that financial aid goes through. This is typically a process called verification. And so if you see any of that language on a financial aid package, you may want to be mindful of the fact that it is subject to change. It's worth asking the college whether or not the financial aid package would cover the same expenses each year. So what happens if the costs go up, as they are likely to do? Will scholarship and grant aid go up to cover those increases in expenses? All right. So this is really hard to see on this page. And so I've broken it down into smaller chunks, but just to give you a little bit of framing for what we're about to look at. So this is a comparison worksheet. We have a workbook and we will make sure to get the link to that workbook to you all through Sadie so that you have access to it at some point down the road. It's on our website, but we have blank comparison sheets in the workbook. But this is an example one of how to use the comparison worksheet. And again, an example of how and why it's so important to compare financial aid offers. And just to be transparent, because some of these numbers are going to look very different. These are numbers from a student who, so I've been with the Scholarship Foundation for 14 years. I probably met this student somewhere between 12 and 13 years ago. So it's a very old example, but it remains one of the best examples that I have encountered about why it's so important to be able to compare financial aid packages. So this particular student came in, the student had financial aid offers from 3 institutions. They were trying to decide between Syracuse, Minnesota, and Purdue. So we were able to pull all of this information directly from the financial aid offers that the student had received. So the first piece that we went through was looking at all of the cost information. So tuition and fees, room and board, books, personal expenses, transportation, etc. And so you'll see the total cost to attend Syracuse was just under $52,000. For Minnesota, it was just over $27,000. And for Purdue, it was about $40,500. So if we were looking at just cost alone, hands down, Minnesota is the most affordable institution. It's about half the cost of Syracuse, which is the most expensive. Now, you'll see in that sort of light blue bar across the top, this particular student who had filed their FAFSA had an expected family contribution of 0. So that means that the student qualifies for maximum financial aid. It does not mean that the student will have everything paid for necessarily. So everything in these green boxes, these are the forms of financial aid that were outlined on the financial aid package that were considered to be good sources of funding. So all of the grant aid, whether it was federal or institutional, need-based or merit-based, scholarships, and we do include work study in that, even though it is a form of self-help aid, it is not money that a student needs to repay. And so we totaled all of that aid up. And so I just want to highlight a few things. So you'll see that for the federal Pell Grant, it says $55.50 across all 3 institutions. And that's because that's awarded at the federal level. It follows the student. And so the student received all the same award amounts for the Pell Grant at all of the schools. And Pell numbers have gone up pretty considerably since then. So this is, again, a very old example at this point. The second grant here is the Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant. Now, this is a campus-based program. So you'll see that the student was awarded only $400 at Purdue, but was awarded $1,000 at Syracuse. The student was not eligible for any state grants and scholarships because they were a Missouri resident and none of these schools were in Missouri. Now, here's where things get interesting. The student was awarded institutional grants and scholarships from the college. At Minnesota, the student received $4,000. At Purdue, it was $4,800. And at Syracuse, it was $27,000. The student also received another federal grant called an Academic Competitiveness Grant. It is no longer available. So, and as you can see, it was a very small award amount. And then the student had work study awards. So in total, they received $37,600 from Syracuse, $13,500 from Minnesota, and $13,800 from Purdue. The unmet need, so and again, in this example, the unmet need is the difference between the cost of the school minus the expected family contribution and the gift aid, including work study. The unmet need for Syracuse was $14,000. For Minnesota, it was $13,510, and for Purdue, it was $26,767. So you'll see now that despite the significant difference in cost, Syracuse is much closer at this point to Minnesota than it was at the beginning. So this last chunk is regarding the loans.
Sorry to interrupt you, Teresa. It looks like we have a question from Angelica.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, I don't know if you wanted to go through everything first, but I did have a question on the previous slide. So I know there was mention too that if you are getting outside scholarships, you have to be careful because I don't know if conflict is the right word, but you won't be able to use them based off of what the school is offering. So on this particular slide, can you explain or maybe demonstrate like which of these lines is outside scholarships that are not offered from the school?
Yeah. So in this particular circumstance, Angelica, so
Mhm.
that's a great question. In this particular circumstance, I don't think the student had anything that was not offered through the school. They do, however, show up on financial aid packages in some circumstances if the scholarship provider has communicated that award to the student, to the school, sorry. So, for example, if I apply for a scholarship and the provider is going to send that funding to the school, the provider will notify the school and the school will add it to my financial aid package. And in some cases, they will reshuffle what they've already offered me. They cannot touch a federal Pell Grant, but they can adjust in most circumstances their institutional aid. So that is the first thing that we see happen in some cases is institutional aid. Ideally, they're adjusting loans first, but that is not, unfortunately, the practice at every school.
Okay, and then when that happens with the scholarships that are outside of the school that can mess around with the scholarships that the school is offering, do they give you enough time to pivot? Let's say you're in the hole like $5,000 because you can't necessarily use X, Y, and Z scholarships. I guess you may be in a situation where you possibly have to get a loan if you decide to go to that school.
Yeah, so there's a couple things there. So the first is that's one of the reasons why we highly encourage students and families to ask that proactively so that they're not applying for outside scholarships only to find out that their school is just going to swap dollar for dollar and the net amount hasn't changed at all in terms of what is owed. Whether or not they give a student enough time to pivot, frankly, depends on the institution. And we see students have adjustments to their financial aid package well into the fall semester. So, I mean, they have started school, they have paid their bill, and then all of a sudden the school is like, oh, hey, yeah, you got that outside scholarship, and it took us a while to process that. And so now we've readjusted, the financial aid we've offered, and now you have a bill, a balance that you did not have 3 weeks ago. The Scholarship Foundation in particular, we have a bit of I don't want to call it a workaround, but our relationship is with the students.
Okay.
We make all of our awards directly to the student. So we issue the funding in the student's name, made payable to them. And we have made our awards, we have calculated our awards to be last dollar funding, with the expectations the student should not need to borrow any federal loans. And so we are confident that the students have all of their need met and are not overfunded. We do not require students to report their funding from us to the institution, although we do not prohibit them from doing that. What we want them to know is if they do choose to notify their institution, it would be possible for the school to make an adjustment. The final thing I would say is that, we do have folks on staff who would help a student and family navigate a conversation with the financial aid office related to this topic if they were looking to explore that conversation more specifically.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Great questions. All right, so this last chunk of this comparison worksheet is really all about the loans. So the orangest lines, the sort of lighter orange lines, are the federal loans that would be good or better. So loans that would be have lower interest rates historically and would be subsidized. So a couple notes here. So the first loan that you'll see is the federal subsidized Stafford, and you'll see again that the student received a flat amount of $3,500 across all three institutions. That's because $3,500 is the most that a first-year college student can receive in the subsidized loan program. That's the maximum. The federal Perkins loan is no longer in existence. I leave it here because it's the only way to adequately depict this financial aid example, but nobody will receive a Perkins loan on their financial aid package in this spring cycle. So we're not going to talk about what it is. You'll see for the subsidized loan that it says the interest rate changes annually. Again, that will be announced sometime in May. But the reason that the subsidized loan is a better borrowing option is because when we're not in this COVID emergency still where federal interest rates are at 0, the federal government pays the interest rate on a subsidized loan until the borrower enters repayment. So the interest rate is not accruing while the student is in school, even if they go into graduate school. Now, the darker orange lines start with the federal unsubsidized loan. And so that loan is not need-based. So virtually everyone who files a FAFSA and is eligible for federal aid is going to be offered an unsubsidized loan. There's no need consideration. You'll see that the student was offered $2,000 again across the board at Syracuse, Minnesota, and Purdue. And again, that has to do with their year in school as well as their dependency status on the FAFSA. So this was a dependent student, so they were only eligible for $2,000 in unsubsidized per year. Again, the interest rate changes annually. And again, this is an unsubsidized loan, so it's the opposite of the subsidized. The federal government is never paying the interest on this loan for the borrower, and so it begins to accrue interest immediately. Dollar for dollar, it costs more to borrow the unsubsidized loan. Now I'm going to kind of break this up into individual schools. So Syracuse, again, is our first column on the left. That's where the financial aid offer from Syracuse stopped. They did not package in a parent loan, nor did they package in any kind of alternative loan. The total loans that were offered to the students were $7,500 for the year. The student did still have a gap between the cost and all financial aid awarded, and that was just shy of $7,000. It was an additional $6,800. So the student's out-of-pocket cost to attend Syracuse, which is essentially their expected family contribution, plus the total amount of loans, plus the gap, was $14,360. If we looked at just the loans, their base loan amount over 4 years would have been $30,000. Now, Minnesota was different. Minnesota offered the parent the opportunity to borrow a parent loan of $8,010. This brought the total loan amount to $13,510. And so just to go back a screen and highlight, that's the exact same amount of the unmet need. So they used that parent loan to basically zero out what the cost would be. So that's what a lot of schools do, and we'll see that in this example with Purdue as well. So the $8,000 loan was packaged onto the financial aid offer for the parent to potentially borrow. So that meant the unmet need was zero. If a student was not looking at all of these individual lines and taking all of these details into consideration, they would get to that unmet need and they'd say, great, it's zero. I've got everything covered, without necessarily realizing that there's $13,000 in loans, and that the base loan amount over 4 years. So again, not including interest or fees or any increases over those 4 years would be $54,000. Now, Purdue did the exact same thing as Minnesota did, but they did it at a much higher dollar amount because they're a higher cost school and they were not nearly as generous on the grant and scholarship side as Syracuse was. So they made an offer of a $19,000 parent loan. Again, the parent does have to pass a credit check on these loans, and the interest rate is higher on these loans. So I think this year it's 7.5%. So the total loan amount for the student and the parent at Purdue would have been $26,000 for the first year. There was again a $0 gap between cost and all financial aid. So Purdue used that plus loan to basically zero out the cost. The annual out-of-pocket cost, so their EFC plus loans plus gap, was $26,000. And the total base loan amount over 4 years was $107,000. So again, not including interest or increases or anything along those lines. So the student went to Syracuse. So yes, there was a gap between cost and all aid, but when you look at these numbers more closely, it really wasn't significantly more for the student to go to Syracuse than it would be for the University of Minnesota. And the student actually was able to go with help from the Scholarship Foundation and actually did not need to borrow this amount of federal loans at all in order to make it affordable. So this is an example of how a high-cost school with a generous financial aid package may actually be a more affordable option, and why it's so important to compare. Because when the student came in, we were pretty sure that they were going to go to Minnesota, but the math helped us identify that that may not actually be in their best interest. All right, so I have just a few more slides. And
I'm
so
sorry, Angelica has
Yes.
another.
No, go ahead.
First of all, I want to say thank you. This is extremely helpful, helping my senior and some other students as well. I know that you mentioned that it's on your website, but I would hope that it's in such a way where, you know, I could just plug in the numbers and voila, is what you provided. Because like you said, I mean, it makes it seem like it would be one over the other, but when you break it down, it's like, oh, wow, that really wasn't the best choice financially.
So I do believe, Angelica, that we have an Excel file on the website that does the calculations for you.
Okay.
And once I stop sharing screen, I will see if I can, or maybe Grace can find that on our website and drop it in the chat so that folks have a direct link to it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. So, you know, one of the big things that we encounter is that students don't have enough financial aid from their school to cover the full cost. And so what happens if you have an unmet need? What happens if you can't cover the full costs of your school? So there are 3 strategies, and so we kind of break them up into 3 buckets. So the first would be to find more aid. So the good thing is that we're having this conversation February 7th. And there is still time to actually find more aid versus having this conversation in June or July when a lot of scholarship deadlines have passed. So the first is that you can submit an appeal. So you can submit an appeal if your circumstances that you included on the FAFSA have changed. So a loss of income, a change in income, some other piece of information that was not included in the FAFSA that you think would be helpful for the college to take into consideration. No guarantees that they will, but we'll talk more about that again in just a moment. And you can look for additional scholarships. So we would highly recommend Scholarship Central, which is a statewide database. Everything on the database is geared towards Missouri and Metro East students. Not everything requires students to stay in state. And so we would highly recommend looking there. Deadlines start rolling pretty quickly here, but go through mid-April to early May. And so now is a great time to be doing that. The second strategy is to reduce costs. And so the ability to do this varies significantly based on what schools we're talking about and student circumstances. But in some cases, students could live at home instead of living on campus. So SLU, for example, is really tells students that they have to live on campus in their first year, but there's some wiggle room with that. And it will shave several $1,000s off of the cost of attendance to live at home versus to live on campus. So exploring that as an option, even if just for the first year, to try to have more time to save money or find additional sources of aid. Living off campus, although this is not as true as it used to be because the cost of off-campus housing has increased so substantially in the last year and a half or 2. Sharing housing, though, off-campus can oftentimes be more affordable than on-campus dorms and apartments. Working a part-time job, that's not so much a cost reduction strategy as it is a way to have a little bit more cash flow and potentially be able to cover some of your expenses. If you are going away to college and you don't absolutely need to have your car with you, maybe consider leaving it at home. So there are several reasons why this could reduce costs. So one, if you bring the car to campus, you probably have to pay for some kind of parking permit. And I am amazed at the number of students each year who can't register for classes because they owe a parking ticket or fee to the university. And having received a couple parking tickets at college campuses, they are not cheap. So that would be one cost that would be avoidable. But also, a lot of times if the student is the primary driver on the car and they're not at home and the vehicle is, the insurance company might give a small reduction on the insurance costs. So those are things to explore with your insurance providers. And then taking advantage of college credit options. So there are a variety of different ways, and we are seeing more and more students graduate high school with at least a handful of college credits because they are cheaper to earn sometimes in high school. You can take summer classes at the community college. Those are also ways to reduce your costs. Even if you're not reducing the bill you owe to your school, you might be reducing the overall expense out of pocket to earn your degree. And then the last bucket, and certainly the bucket that is least exciting for a lot of students, is to outright change their plan. So it might be that you need to consider a school that is less expensive or one that has offered a better financial aid package. We do see students who get their financial aid packages and realize that it's just not financially feasible to go the route they initially planned. And so they start at the community college and make a plan to transfer down the road. It doesn't have to be that you earn a full associate's degree before transferring, but sometimes a semester or a year to recalibrate and apply to a different set of schools or meet deadlines differently can make a difference in affordability. And if you are eligible for A+, that would be something to consider using, and again, get some of those credits out of the way at the community college and then transfer down the road. So I do want to just spend a quick moment or two talking about professional judgment reviews and special circumstances appeals. These terms are kind of used interchangeably, but they're roughly the same thing. So it's essentially going to the college and saying that I have additional information or new information that I would like you to take into consideration. So you can do what's called an income-related appeal, which would ultimately affect the expected family contribution, or you could do an expenses-related appeal, which would impact the cost of attendance. So in terms of who can make those appeals, the parent or parents of a dependent undergraduate student, so basically the adult or adults who are listed on the student's FAFSA, could appeal. Generally speaking, they could appeal because of a loss of income. Maybe they've lost a job. Maybe they've had a partial loss of income. So, you know, in 2020, so when we filed the FAFSA for this year using 2020 tax information, we saw a lot of families where parents had worked significant overtime in 2020 in the healthcare field, and that income had dropped off substantially because they were no longer doing that kind of overtime. So that could be grounds for an appeal. It could be a change in marital status, or perhaps the parent is enrolled full-time in a degree program. Those kinds of things would be something that a student could appeal for. An independent student can also appeal. And then if your EFC is already 0, that's the lowest the EFC goes. It's not that you can't appeal. There's just no need to go through the formal process of a professional judgment review because there's nothing the college can do in the FAFSA to result in additional aid eligibility from the federal or the state government. You can still certainly let the college know that you are not able to afford the cost of the school with the financial aid they've offered and ask for more financial assistance, but it would not necessarily need to be a full professional judgment review or appeals process. I'm realizing too that I didn't really address the specifics of an expenses related appeal. So expenses related appeals are more going to be the student saying to the school, you've given this budget for my cost of attendance, but I have additional expenses for, medical supplies, or my costs for dependent care are significantly higher, or I have excessive transportation costs. They maybe have other educational expenses, let's say an art student who has to purchase a number of supplies. You might be able to go through an appeal for an increase to the cost of attendance, but we see these very, very rarely because frankly, most students don't have enough financial aid. So increasing their cost of attendance only means that they have more money to make up to cover their expenses. Let's see, where was I? So just a few things to know as we wrap up here. So just keep in mind that most financial aid eligibility is going to be based upon that expected family contribution. So to receive any more federal aid, to receive some state aid, and even institutional aid, it's really going to be dependent on that number. And so seeing increases to that may not occur if the EFC does not change. If you have questions about any of the paperwork or the supporting documentation that may be required to do a review or an appeal, the first stop would be to contact the financial aid office. And we would highly recommend that you submit everything as soon as possible. Generally speaking, if schools hold back any financial aid for an appeals process, those are awarded first come, first serve. Some schools do have general appeals, and those are reviewed on a case-by-case basis. So again, if you have any concerns about your unique circumstances, the first step would be to contact the financial aid office and just have a conversation to see if it would be something that they would consider before you go to the work of gathering all of that documentation. And then again, just always contact your school. These are general guidelines, and schools have their own specific processes and policies. So I know that we are getting close to time, and just like Sadie started us on time, we really want to be sure that we end on time so that you all are able to get on with your evening. So Grace and I are part of a team of student advisors. You are welcome to contact any one of us at any point in time for help. So if you have financial aid packages that you want to sit down and compare with someone, we will sit down with you and compare those financial aid packages. So we will actually help you do the math. If you are interested in learning more about the Scholarship Foundation's programs, we would be happy to sit down and talk to you about those and help you identify what opportunities might be available to you based on your plans, your circumstances. But you know, the punchline is the Scholarship Foundation funds almost 500 students per year with just shy of $5 million in scholarships, grants, and interest-free, fee-free student loans. We have a number of applications that are currently open and are due April 17th of this year. And all of our funding is available to students who demonstrate academic potential. So it's a 2.0 cumulative GPA or higher, good character, and financial need. So our EFC cutoff for the FAFSA is 15,000. If you are for any reason unable to file a FAFSA, we do have an alternate process for those students, and we would be happy to talk to you about that and get you the paperwork to fill out to be considered still for our funding. So that's like really in a nutshell. There's so much more I could say, but as I said, I tend to live in the weeds, and so could probably bog you down with a lot of details. This is the Scholarship Foundation's general information, and I don't know if there are any other questions that you want me to try to answer before we wrap up. Any questions for the good of the whole?
I have another one. I know you had mentioned grants. Do you have any recommendations as far as websites for grants for higher education?
Yeah, so we would recommend Scholarship Central. So I'm going to drop the link to that in the chat. So that's, again, oops, I did not get that all the way in there. Moved too quickly. So Scholarship Central is, again, a local database, and it's got scholarships and grants. We generally recommend that students start with their colleges and then with local opportunities, just because anything national like fastweb.com or scholarships.com, you know, being open to every other, you know, high school senior across the country who's also trying to figure this out, it's just exponentially harder to get those awards. And so by starting local, you increase the likelihood that you might receive those opportunities.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, this is Janine Rideout. Sorry, I'm in my car, so I won't start my video.
That's okay.
Thank you so much for all of this information. It's been really, really helpful. I did have a question about EFC review and whether the Scholarship Foundation offers any assistance to families with that. We did complete our FAFSA for my senior daughter in October, and the EFC for the family came back much, much higher than we expected it to be. compared to 2 years ago when my other daughter was in college and our income
Oh.
hasn't really changed very much. So I was a little baffled and
Yeah.
I'm wondering if I did something wrong.
Yeah, so yes, so you could contact an advisor to go through the FAFSA with you just to make sure everything was filled out correctly. If you determined that you needed or wanted to try to do an appeal with the college, we would be happy to assist with that. And the sort of question that you didn't ask there that I'm going to just address anyway is that, the Scholarship Foundation on our applications, we do also have a place for students and families to indicate that they have circumstances that they would like us to take into consideration. And we do actually adjust EFCs for our math only. We generally recommend that students and families, if they have circumstances, try to get the EFC adjusted through the college, because we can't go into the FAFSA, but the colleges could. And so our adjustment would be only for our math, whereas the college's adjustment on the FAFSA could potentially indicate eligibility for additional federal or state grant aid. And so and then it would be an actual new EFC from the FAFSA, and we would honor that new EFC, whatever it was.
I see. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Other questions? No? All right. Well, thank you so much, Teresa. Thank you so much, Grace. This was really informative and a great session. I do want to make a plug for the Scholarship Foundation. They helped me tremendously. When I was in college, I received an interest-free loan from the Scholarship Foundation of St. Louis, and that was just such a blessing for me. So I appreciate the work that you all do. It's extremely important for students here in the St. Louis region. So thank you again, Teresa. Thank you, Grace. Thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. Our next College Prep Talk is going to be on March 7th. We're going to be focusing on communication strategies for our high school students. So we hope that your students join us for that session.